As the wheels of his Chevy Silverado kicked up gravel, Carter Hayes spotted the rickety sign marking the entrance to Black Creek. Population, 324. It read, its paint peeling and its letters barely legible. This small Appalachian town was where he planned to find solace and finish his novel, far from the chaos of his city life. His Aunt Clara had passed away 6 months ago, leaving him her dilapidated farmhouse near the hollow. Carter didn't remember much about his childhood summers in Black Creek, but he knew the locals loved their superstitions. Stories of curses, witches, and spirits were woven into the town's DNA, much like the fog that clung to the woods. The farmhouse was just as he remembered. Weathered wood, moss creeping up its sides, and an eerie stillness about it. As he stepped onto the porch, the floorboards creaked like they were groaning in protest. Inside, dust danced in the shafts of sunlight, filtering through broken shutters. It wasn't until the first night that Carter heard it. Faint whispers. They seemed to come from the hollow behind the house, where Black Creek meandered sluggishly through the dense forest. At first, he thought it was the wind, but there was a cadence to the sounds, soft, almost musical, and undeniably human. The next morning, Carter decided to explore the town, hoping to get a sense of the place and maybe dig up inspiration for his book. Black Creek was exactly what he expected. A single gas station, a general store, and a diner called Mabel's. Inside Mabel's, a cluster of locals gave him polite nods, though their eyes lingered on him longer than felt comfortable. He slid onto a stool at the counter, ordering coffee and a slice of pie. "You must be Clara's nephew," the waitress said, setting the coffee in front of him. She was middle-aged, with a kind face and weary eyes. Her name tag read Josie. "That's me," Carter replied. "Carter Hayes." "You staying out at the old farmhouse?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Yeah. Why?" Josie exchanged a glance with an older man in the corner, who shook his head as if to say, "Don't tell him," but Josie leaned in closer. "People around here don't like talking about it, but the hollow behind your house, it's cursed." Carter chuckled, sipping his coffee. "Let me guess. Witches, ghosts, or both?" Josie's expression didn't change. "Both," she said flatly. According to Josie, Black Creek Hollow had been the site of a witch trial in the late 1800s. A woman named Eliza Kane had been accused of witchcraft after a series of mysterious deaths plagued the town. When the townsfolk burned her at the stake, she cursed them and their descendants, vowing that no one would ever find peace as long as the hollow stood. "They say you can still hear her whispers if you get too close," Josie said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and sometimes people disappear." Carter found it hard to take the story seriously. Curses and witches were great for fiction, but in real life, he wasn't buying it. Still, when he returned home, the whispers seemed louder. By the third night, Carter's sleep was fitful. The whispers weren't just in the hollow anymore, they were inside the house. Desperate for answers, he ventured to the edge of the hollow with a flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating gnarled trees and underbrush. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. "Turn back." The voice was clear, distinct, and directly behind him. Carter spun around, his flashlight landing on an old man with a wild, unkempt beard. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Carter demanded. "Name's Amos," the man said. "I used to live out here, but the hollow, it took my family." Amos explained that the curse wasn't just a story. People who ventured too close to the hollow often came back changed, or didn't come back at all. "It gets inside your head," he said. "Feeds on your fears, your guilt." Carter tried to dismiss Amos's warning, but things at the farmhouse only got worse. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision. The whispers turned into voices calling his name. One night, Carter woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Grabbing a baseball bat, he threw open the door, only to find muddy footprints leading from the hollow to his front steps. Panicked, he called the sheriff, but when they arrived, the footprints were gone. "You're letting the stories get to you," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. By the end of the week, Carter decided he'd had enough. If the hollow was the source of the disturbances, he was going to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and sheer stubbornness, he ventured into the woods at midnight. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. The deeper he went, the louder the whispers grew until they were deafening. Then he saw it. A circle of stones in a clearing, blackened with soot. In the center stood a single wooden post, charred and weathered with time, the site of Eliza Kane's execution. "Why are you here?" a voice asked. Carter turned to see a woman standing at the edge of the clearing. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her lips twisted in a sorrowful smile. "You're Eliza," he whispered. She nodded. "I was wronged, and so I wronged them in return. But my vengeance has grown beyond me. The hollow consumes more than I ever intended." Eliza told Carter that the curse could be lifted, but it required a sacrifice, something of great personal value. "You must give it willingly," she said. "Only then will the hollow release its hold." Carter thought of his Aunt Clara, of the peaceful life she'd wanted for him in this place. He knew what he had to do. Returning to the farmhouse, Carter found his laptop, the only copy of the novel he'd been working on for 3 years. It was more than just a manuscript. It was his hope for the future, his escape from a mundane life. He carried it back to the hollow, placing it in the circle of stones. "I give this freely," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The whispers reached a crescendo, then stopped. The air grew lighter, the fog dissipated, and the oppressive weight lifted from his chest. In the days that followed, the farmhouse felt different, warmer, more inviting. The whispers were gone, and the hollow was silent. Carter stayed in Black Creek, finding inspiration in its tranquility. Though he mourned the loss of his novel, he began a new one, this time inspired by the town and its secrets. The townsfolk, once wary, began to welcome him as one of their own. Josie even smiled when he walked into Mabel's. But sometimes late at night, Carter thought he heard faint whispers from the hollow. Not menacing, but gentle, like a lullaby carried on the wind. And he wondered if Eliza Kane was finally at peace. The Willow Bridge wasn't much of a landmark, just an old wooden structure spanning a shallow creek at the edge of Wayland County. Most of the locals avoided it, save for the occasional fisherman or a reckless teenager looking to test their courage on a dare. But to Grace Turner, the bridge held a magnetic pull. Grace, a 28-year-old journalist with a penchant for small-town mysteries, had returned to her childhood home in Wayland after a decade away. The bridge was where her best friend, Lily Hargrove, had disappeared 15 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a torn bracelet and an unshakable feeling of dread. As Grace stood on the weathered planks of the bridge, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. The air was thick, the overhanging willow branches swaying in a breeze she couldn't feel. "Looking for ghosts, Grace?" a voice called behind her. She turned to see Sheriff Tom Dugan, his hat tipped back and a bemused grin on his face. "Something like that," she replied, brushing her auburn hair from her face. Tom frowned, his jovial expression fading. "You shouldn't be out here after dark. Folks around here don't like to talk about it. But there's something wrong with this place." Grace spent the next day digging through old newspaper archives and interviewing locals. The story of Willow Bridge was far darker than she remembered. The bridge had been built in 1894, connecting Wayland to the nearby logging town of Copper Hollow. Almost immediately, strange events were reported. Workers vanishing, unexplainable accidents, and whispered tales of shadowy figures lurking beneath the structure. Then, in 1903, the entire Harlan family disappeared from their home just a stone's throw from the bridge. Their belongings were left untouched, but their whereabouts were never discovered. Lily's disappearance in 2008 was just the latest in a string of tragedies tied to the bridge. "What do you think happened to them?" Grace asked Mrs. Mathers, the town's unofficial historian. Mrs. Mathers, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s, leaned closer. "The shadows took them," she whispered. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The image of the bridge kept creeping into her mind, as if calling her back. Finally, at midnight, She grabbed her flashlight and notepad and headed out. The bridge looked different in the moonlight, longer, darker, as if it stretched into another world. Grace hesitated before stepping onto the creaking planks. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing unnaturally. The shadows beneath the bridge rippled. At first she thought it was a trick of the water, but then one of the shadows moved against the current, climbing the bank with a serpentine grace. Grace froze as a figure emerged, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its face was a void. Before she could scream, the flashlight slipped from her hands, the beam scattering across the underbrush. Grace woke in her car, parked at the edge of the bridge. Her flashlight was on the passenger seat, its batteries inexplicably drained. "What the hell happened?" she muttered, her hands trembling. Back at her parents' house, Grace sifted through her notes. The details were hazy, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever she saw wasn't human. She needed help. The next day, she visited Dr. Eli Harper, a retired professor of folklore who lived in Wayland. Harper had spent decades researching local legends, and his name often came up in conversations about the town's eerie history. "The shadows beneath Willow Bridge?" Harper said, raising an eyebrow. "You're braver than most to even ask about them." He explained that the bridge was built on land once considered sacred by the Cherokee people. A legend told of a spirit, known as Tsuganohi, which punished those who disturbed the balance of nature. "The spirit feeds on fear and loss," Harper said. "It takes those who linger too long, drawing them into its realm." Determined to uncover the truth, Grace returned to the bridge during the day. This time, she brought her camera, a voice recorder, and a small vial of salt, a precaution suggested by Harper. As she examined the underside of the bridge, she noticed symbols etched into the wood, ancient runes that pulsed faintly when touched. Her recorder crackled to life. "Grace?" a voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. She dropped the device, her heart racing. It was Lily's voice. The shadows beneath the bridge began to writhe, taking shape. Grace stumbled backward as a familiar figure stepped forward. Lily, or at least something wearing her face. "Help me," it said, its voice distorted. That night, Grace and Harper devised a plan. Using the runes as a focal point, they would perform a cleansing ritual to sever the connection between the bridge and the spirit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace and Harper stood on the bridge, candles flickering around them. The air grew colder with every word Harper chanted, the shadows beneath the bridge twisting violently. Suddenly, the spirit emerged, a mass of writhing darkness with countless faces, each one frozen in a silent scream. "Finish it," Grace yelled, clutching the vial of salt. Harper's voice faltered, but he pressed on, his chants growing louder. Grace hurled the salt into the shadows, and they shrieked, retreating like smoke in the wind. With one final deafening roar, the spirit dissipated, leaving the air still and silent. The next morning, Grace returned to the bridge. For the first time, it felt ordinary. The oppressive weight was gone. The runes faded into the wood as if they'd never existed. In the weeks that followed, the townsfolk began to venture near the bridge again. Fishermen returned, and kids played in the creek without fear. As for Grace, she wrote the story of the shadows beneath Willow Bridge, ensuring that the truth of what happened would never be forgotten. But sometimes, on quiet nights, she swore she could still hear Lily's voice, soft, distant, and free. Nestled at the edge of a dense forest, Ashwood Manor was once the grandest estate in the county, a sprawling Victorian mansion with towering spires and ornate iron gates. But time had not been kind to the house, and neither had its dark history. After inheriting the property from her estranged grandmother, Margaret, Emily Vance had no intention of staying long. She was a pragmatic 33-year-old writer, more at home in her Brooklyn apartment than in the middle of nowhere. But as Emily pulled her car up the long, overgrown driveway, she couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. Her grandmother had passed away without warning, and the lawyer's letter that followed revealed little except the shocking fact that Emily was now the sole owner of Ashwood Manor. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that made you feel like you were being watched. "Guess I'd better see what I'm working with," Emily muttered, grabbing her bag and stepping out of the car. The front door creaked open under her touch, revealing a grand foyer draped in shadows. Dust motes danced in the weak light streaming through the cracked stained glass windows. "Welcome back, Miss Vance," a voice said from the darkness. Emily jumped, spinning around to see an elderly man standing in the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said, bowing slightly. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I'm Walter, the caretaker. Your grandmother instructed me to keep the house in order." Emily spent the first night in a guest room trying to ignore the unsettling groans and creaks of the old house. Walter had assured her it was just the sound of an aging building, but as the hours dragged on, Emily wasn't so sure. At around 3 a.m., she was startled awake by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept out of her room. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The beam of light swept across the corridor, revealing nothing but faded wallpaper and a series of closed doors. But then she heard it again, a faint whisper, low and guttural, coming from behind one of the doors. Against her better judgment, Emily opened it. The room was empty, except for a single rocking chair that swayed gently back and forth, though there was no draft to explain its movement. On the wall opposite, someone had scrawled a message in what looked like ash. "Leave while you still can." The next morning, Emily confronted Walter. "Did my grandmother ever talk about the house? About anything strange happening here?" she asked, her coffee cup shaking in her hand. Walter hesitated before answering. "Your grandmother was a proud woman, but she was also a haunted one. She used to say the house had a way of keeping its secrets." Emily decided to dig deeper. She found her grandmother's study, a room locked with a rusted key Walter provided. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. Shelves lined with books on the occult, journals, and old photographs filled the space. One journal in particular caught Emily's eye. The entries were frantic, written in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. "The house is alive. It feeds on our fears, on our pain. I thought I could protect her, but the shadows know. They always know." Who was her? Emily wondered. As she explored the house further, Emily noticed inconsistencies. A hallway that seemed longer than it should be, a window visible from the outside that didn't match the layout inside. One evening, while tracing the source of cold air seeping from behind a bookshelf, Emily discovered a hidden latch. The shelf swung open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into the dark. The basement was unlike anything Emily had seen before. The walls were lined with symbols carved into the stone, some of which glowed faintly. In the center of the room stood a circular altar, surrounded by burnt-out candles. On the altar lay a locket. Emily recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her mother, who had disappeared when Emily was 6 years old. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The moment her fingers touched the metal, the room seemed to shudder, and a voice filled her head. "Help me!" Emily turned to Walter for answers, but he refused to speak. "Some truths are better left buried," he said before disappearing into the woods. Determined, Emily turned to her grandmother's journals again. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. Margaret had been trying to protect Emily from the house's influence, just as she had tried to protect Emily's mother. But the house was relentless. Ashwood Manor wasn't just a home, it was a trap, a living entity that fed on the spirits of those who dwelled within it. The altar in the basement was the key, a tether that kept the souls bound to the house. Emily realized she had a choice: leave the house and let it continue its cycle of torment, or face whatever evil lingered within its walls. Emily returned to the basement, armed with her grandmother's notes and a handful of salt, candles, and matches. She lit the candles around the altar, chanting the incantation Margaret had written in her journal. The air grew heavy, the walls seeming to close in as the shadows coalesced into a humanoid form. It towered over her, its face a shifting mass of darkness. "You cannot free them," it hissed. "They belong to me." Emily held the locket tightly. Not anymore. She threw the salt onto the altar, the symbols glowing brighter as the shadow screamed. The sound was deafening, a chorus of voices, her mother's, her grandmother's, and countless others, crying out in unison. With a final flash of light, the shadow disintegrated, leaving the room eerily silent. When Emily emerged from the basement, the house felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The air was no longer stifling, and the eerie whispers were gone. She packed her belongings and left Ashwood Manor, vowing never to return. But as she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, she thought she saw her grandmother standing at the window, smiling. Perhaps, in some way, the house had been redeemed. Or perhaps it was simply waiting for its next victim.